For this presentation, we are looking at water. Specifically, we are going to answer the question, how do water's unique properties make life possible? So first, we're going to take a look at a video, specifically about polarity and why the polarity makes water behave strangely.
How come some insects are able to walk on the surface of a pond, but you quickly sink to the bottom when you try to walk on water? And why do lakes freeze from the top down in winter? In a word, the answer to all of these questions is polarity. Water is a simple molecule made up of one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms, but it is essential to life. In fact, water makes up approximately 60% of the adult human being's body weight. The polarity within those water molecules gives this common substance the properties that make it unique and life-sustaining. Polarity refers to the unequal sharing of electrons within a molecule. For water, the bonding between the oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms within a single water molecule is like a tug of war between a big, strong football player and a cute little toddler. Oxygen is a larger atom with more protons in its nucleus than hydrogen. These positive charges are like a person's physical strength. They are able to attract the negatively charged electrons in the bond, just like a strong individual is able to overpower a weaker individual in a tug of war. So, oxygen is able to attract more than its fair share of electrons. Because hydrogen is smaller and has less strength, or fewer protons, it loses the tug of war and attracts fewer than its fair share of electrons. So the oxygen in water behaves as though it's negative, and the hydrogens behave as though they're positive. The bonds within a single water molecule are called polar covalent bonds. Covalent means that the electrons are shared. But, as we just learned, polar means that these electrons are not shared equally. In water, the oxygen acts negative, and the hydrogens act positive. Since negative and positive attract, that oxygen is attracted to the hydrogen atoms in neighboring water molecules. A special type of bond forms between water molecules known as a hydrogen bond. Hydrogen bonds don't just happen in water either. They can form between a water molecule and different substances that are polar or ionic. Water's ability to stick to itself is called cohesion, while water's ability to stick to other substances is called adhesion. Now, think back to the initial questions. First, why are some insects able to walk on water? Surface tension due to hydrogen bonding creates a thin film on the surface of water that gives enough resistance for super light insects to walk on. You can't walk on it because the hydrogen bonds aren't strong enough to hold you up. Why does ice float on top of liquid water? For most other substances, the solid state is more dense than the liquid state. But that is not the case for water. Hydrogen bonds keep water molecules farther apart in frozen water than in liquid water. The farther apart the molecules are, the less dense that solid is. So ice is about 9% less dense than water, which means it floats on the top. That's why lakes freeze from the top down and aquatic life is able to survive through a cold winter every year. It is the polarity of the water molecule and the resulting hydrogen bonding that account for water's unique properties. So, the reason that water is so special, from inside your cells to the world's oceans, is simply because it is a polar molecule.
So, polarity is arguably the most important property. We did talk about in class, I used the term greedy, that since oxygen is a more greedy element, it kind of pulls those electrons closer to it, which causes those partial charges. It is not ionic because it's two nonmetals that are bonded together. So it is a covalent bond, but it does exhibit some tendencies of having those partial charges, which leads to the polar nature. So a couple questions. First question, what does polarity refer to? So how do we define the word polarity? Second question, which of the statements below correctly describes the partial charges on the atoms in a water molecule? Third question, what type of bond exists between neighboring water molecules? The key word here is between molecules, not between atoms. And then number 4, what happens to the amount of hydrogen bonding between water molecules as water is heated up? So with the first question, polarity is the unequal sharing. It's still sharing, it is still covalent, it's just a type of covalent bond where they are not shared equally, which leads to those partial charges. Question 2, the oxygen acts as if it has a negative charge, and the hydrogen atoms act if they have a positive charge. So due to the unequal sharing, the electrons are closer to the oxygen, causing that partial negative charge. Since the electrons are further away from the hydrogens, it acts as if it has a partial positive. For question number 3, the key word here is between molecules. Those are the hydrogen bonds. And the hydrogen bonds is what allows for cohesion as well as adhesion to take place. And then finally, question 4, as water molecules are heated up, the hydrogen bonding decreases. They're very weak bonds. Just think about what happens when you heat up an ice cube. It melts. There's a lot more energy, so there's a lot less organization in terms of bonding. The more bonds you have, the more organization you have. The less bonds you have, the less organization, and typically more energy. So our first property is water is polar. We just watched a video on it. We have those slight negative and slight positive charges, which allows for hydrogen bonding between the molecules. As you can see in the picture that I have drawn, we see kind of those shared electrons going more toward the oxygen instead of being shared equally. This is what causes those partial charges. And then those partial charges, we have opposites attract between two different water molecules. The partial positive charge of the hydrogen is attracted to the partial negative of a different oxygen. So once again, quick review. Why is water polar? Well, it's a unique molecule. Is it because the shared electrons orbit oxygen's nucleus for a little more than they do the hydrogens, because they hold on to electrons for more than oxygen does, or because if it wasn't water, water could dissolve things? It's going to be letter B. The shared electrons orbit the oxygen's nucleus for a little more time than they do the hydrogens. I told you that oxygen is a little bit more greedy. It's greedy because it is bigger. It has more inside its nucleus, so it has a greater pull from its positive charges to attract negative charge. So basically the whole bigger is better when it comes to atoms in terms of attracting electrons. Our second property, water has a high specific heat. This is one that's a little bit harder to understand, but it's relatively simple. It takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature of water. So, ponds, oceans, they basically stay in even temperature even if the outside temperatures are much colder or much hotter. Specifically hotter, you're not going to see a pond boil if it's 120 degrees outside. It just takes a lot of energy to raise that temperature up 1 degree. This is also one of the reasons why if you have a good cooler, ice takes a long time to melt, because same general idea, it takes a lot of energy to raise the temperature. So if the temperature is cold, it's going to take some time to melt the ice. For our human body, since we are primarily made up of water, it's important to maintain that homeostasis. So we don't fluctuate our temperatures all that much, because water acts as a good insulator for our body in terms of maintaining that 98.6 degrees temperature. Property number 3, water is cohesive. The property of cohesion is the ability of water to bond to itself. We already talked about the hydrogen bonding between the partial negative of the oxygen with a different partial positive of a hydrogen. A word that's typically used with cohesion is surface tension, how water kind of forms a skin, and there are some things that can float on top of water because they don't have enough force to break the hydrogen bonding between waters. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the water strider and its ability to walk on water. As you can see, there are those little dimples that are around. There's other examples of things floating on water. As you can see in the preview, the basilisk lizard is one that has an adaptation where it can actually run on water. So the key thing is basically not breaking the hydrogen bonding. And this is something that we will test in the lab as well. So water bonding to other water molecules, we call it cohesion. I'm sure in middle school some of you have done the drops on a penny, and we'll take a look at that in lab as well. Fourth property is water is adhesive. Adhesion. This is water sticking to other things. This is based off of polarity. Polar things like polar things, and if they're polar or even ionic and have a charge, opposites attract. The opposite charges are going to attract, similar to how hydrogen bonding works between water molecules and cohesion. So this time of the year, in the fall, we start to see dew. It gets colder out, all that moisture in the air. You might see water molecules attach to the spider webs, and the neat thing is the individual droplets are attached. So you don't see kind of water as a whole, you see water in individual shapes. So pretty neat kind of morning observation. Same thing with different plants. If they don't have roots, they have to absorb water right through their leaves. So the ability for water to be absorbed by these plants is adhesion, since they are bonding to water. Something other than water is bonding to water. So water bonding to other things. Now we do have a relationship as well. When water goes against gravity, both cohesion and adhesion are utilized. Plants are our biggest example here. Water is pulled up from the roots into its leaves for photosynthesis. So you have adhesion in terms of connecting to the interior of the plant, whether it be the roots, the stem, or in the leaves, and you have cohesion kind of forming between the water molecules to form kind of a pressure as it goes up. Another example of this would be if you have a paper towel, you dip the paper towel in water, water is moving upwards, going against gravity. A very common example is putting celery in different colored water. Over a couple hours, you will see the leaves and part of the stem start to turn those colors, showing that that water is going against gravity and kind of being sucked up into the plant, into the leaves. The key thing here is going against gravity, and you need the combination of both of those properties to assist in repelling the gravitational force. So quick review, what is the difference between cohesion and adhesion? It's cohesion when it's attracted to other water molecules, while adhesion is when water is attracted to other polar. Cohesion is when water is attracted to other polar, while adhesion is when water is attracted to other water, or there is no difference. So think for a second, what is the difference between these two things? The answer is actually letter A. Cohesion, water is attracted to itself. Adhesion, it is attracted to other things, whether it's polar, and they also may be attracted to ionic. But the key thing to remember is polar likes polar. So something to kind of make you think a little bit. Looks like we have an ice cube that is floating. And an ice cube that is sinking. So what is going on here? Well, what is going on is the density of water. One of those things was actually not water. Water has a unique property where its solid form actually is less dense than the liquid form. A lot of things, when they freeze or they solidify, are more dense because the bonds between the molecules is actually shorter. With water, things actually expand, as you see with the picture in the lower left-hand corner. In ice, we see a lot more space in between the bonds. More space means it's going to be less dense. The closer molecules are, it's going to be more dense. So ice floats with water, but with other things it actually sinks because we don't have that separation. This is an important thing with aquatic life because since ice freezes from the top down, then that aquatic life can simply live at the bottom, and remember, the high specific heat will keep it a pretty stable temperature. If ice was more dense, it would freeze from the bottom up. So basically your fish would be pushed to the top and essentially would be killed, and you would have ponds and whatnot that wouldn't have any life after basically one bad winter. And our final property is water is the universal solvent. If there's one thing to remember is like dissolves like. What I mean by that is polar things dissolve polar things. They will also dissolve ionic things, things with a charge. Non-polar things dissolve non-polar things. An example of non-polar is oil. Polar and polar don't mix. So if you put water and oil together, they form layers. But if you put, for instance, two polar things together, they will mix and water will dissolve. So water is a good dissolver. So this brings us to the solute and solvent. Solvent is what does the dissolving. And this all comes back to the polarity of water. So how does water dissolve salt? We have our water molecule right here. Remember, it is polar. We have NaCl. If you recall in class, the ionic bond of sodium chloride, sodium gives up an electron, making it that +1 charge. Chlorine gains the electron, giving it the negative charge. So the partial charges of water are attracted to the charges of sodium, the whole opposites attract idea. So the partial positives of the hydrogen atoms are attracted to the negative ion, that is chlorine, and the partial negative of the oxygen in water is attracted to the positive ion of sodium. So it basically pulls NaCl apart. And when you pull them apart, that's what's dissolving. because you're taking a compound and putting it into its ionic form, which is the individual ions. Instead of being a compound, you pull them apart into basically the atomic form. However, not everything loves water. We kind of touched upon this with your nonpolar things. If they are polar and they will interact with water and water can dissolve them, we call them hydrophilic. Philic means loving. Hydro means water, so water loving. If it is nonpolar, it is going to be phobic, which means fear. So common things we're going to talk about are going to be your oils and your fats that simply don't mix with water. So if you have oil and fat on your fingers and you go wash them off in the sink with water, nothing's going to happen because they're going to repel each other. So that's why we need soap. Soap is nonpolar. It's going to attach itself to the oils to get it off your fingers. So we'll take a look at this and how things mix and how things do not mix. But the key thing is like dissolves like. Polar dissolves polar, nonpolar dissolves nonpolar. Now on the bottom of page 5, I want you to answer one of these open-ended questions. First one, table salt is an ionic compound. As with other ionic compounds, it dissolves in water. When placed in water, Na and Cl form ions. Na is positive, Cl is negative. How do the water molecules interact with these ions? So how does water pull apart the ions? So what does it mean to actually dissolve? Which we just saw in that video. Letter B, a plant's roots absorb water. Water is needed by all parts of the plant. Based on what we learned about polarity, explain how water is transported through tiny tubes from the roots to the leaves. So how does water go against gravity and get to the leaves of the plant? And then finally, letter C, if you drop a metal paper clip into a cup of water, it'll sink to the bottom. However, with practice, you can gently place a metal paper clip on the surface of the water, and it will balance or appear to float. Why does it float? Think about your water strider here. The little insect that is able to walk on water. So I'll give you a minute to kind of write down, pick one of those questions and write it in the box on the bottom of page 5. Okay, so let's take a look at these answers. For the first one, we have the whole opposites attract thing between the water molecule's partial charges and the negative and positive charges of the sodium ion and the chloride ion. The chloride is the negative ion and the sodium is the positive. So the water kind of pulls apart based off of the attraction to the charges. The hydrogen partial positive is connected to the negative chloride ion, and the partial negative of the oxygen on the water molecule is attracted to the positive sodium ion. It just pulls them apart and kind of breaks the bond. For letter B, we have capillary action here. So water is attracted to both itself as well as the inside of the plant, going up from the roots to the leaves. So it kind of raises, as together, connecting to the sides of the plant as well as to each other as it goes against gravity and gets up to the leaves. And finally, letter C. This is going to be a surface tension, which is a type of cohesion where it kind of forms an invisible surface. Basically, I like to call it like the water forms like a skin based off the hydrogen bonding and the polarity. And this allows for the paperclip as well as the water strider to walk on. You have to be very careful, and it takes a little bit of practice to kind of lay a paperclip on top of the water, because if you put too much force, it breaks those hydrogen bonds, which are very weak. So, random thing. What do you think happens if you mix Red Bull and milk? We do have a chemical reaction. And that chemical reaction is essentially a complete separation. The acid in Red Bull causes the protein to separate in the milk. So basically the whole Little Miss Muffet nursery rhyme, we are making essentially curds and whey here, separating out that protein. The protein is negatively charged, and when the acid is added to it, it neutralizes the charge and makes the proteins clump together. There's a lot of videos out there on YouTube where apparently this is a milk and Red Bull challenge. I don't recommend participating in this, but if you need a good laugh, have at it in terms of watching the videos. The final thing we're going to talk about is pH, which is dealing with acids and bases. For those of you that have pools, pool acidity is something you got to keep a good grasp over throughout the summer, just to make sure you have a safe environment to swim in, as well as dealing with any algae that may creep up and just kind of protecting your liner as well. So water can separate into two different ions. You have your OH negative and you have your H positive. Now your H positive deals with your acids. And that's why a lot of your acids start with H, like HCl, H2SO4. Your acids have a pH from 0 to 6. So the lower the number, the stronger the acid. Example with vinegar. Vinegar has acetic acid. Bases, on the other hand, substances that remove H plus from a solution. So your acids donate it, your bases take it away. These are going to be your higher numbers, 8 to 14. And these are primarily going to be your cleaning supplies. Baking soda, soaps, things like that. And then finally, neutral. These are going to be substances that have no acid or base properties. Notice how H2O is made up of H plus as well as OH minus, so it kind of cancels itself out. And this is going to be a pH of 7, and pure water, simply H2O, no additives, not tap water, just pure water, is going to be neutral. So when we look at a pH scale, our gastric juices, our stomach acid is a very low pH. A lot of juices from your fruits are going to be lower pH. This is why sometimes it's very sweet and might burn a little bit, like your cranberry juice or your orange juice. We look at the base. Human blood is pretty close to being neutral, but it is slightly basic. And a lot of your household cleaners, with bleach being a big one, is higher on the basic scale. Both strong acids and strong bases can cause damage to your body. So it's There's a misconception that acids are only bad, but bases can do just as much, if not more damage. So why is it important for the stomach to have a very low pH? Well, because think about what it does. You have to digest your food properly. Looking at the diagram, the pH of blood is 7.4, which is slightly basic. Pretty close to neutral, but slightly basic. So as we can see, there's a lot of importance with water. Individual properties, a lot can stem from it being polar. The polarity leads to hydrogen bonding, and the hydrogen bonding leads to a whole array of stuff, from it being less dense as a solid, cohesion, adhesion, its ability to be a universal solvent. But the key things is remembering what polar means, that unequal sharing, and that's really kind of one of the most important aspects of water, because that leads to a lot of other properties. Also, we have the high specific heat, the high heat capacity. This allows us to maintain homeostasis in our body, because as the weather around us changes, our internal temperature isn't going to fluctuate too much, which helps maintain those homeostatic pathways and keep us alive. So thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.